Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning. This is Transatlantic Visegrad Insight Breakfast. I think we'll be starting now. And today we're having a discussion with a great Central European team across Atlantic, also as well as from the center of Europe, the Visegrad countries. I'll introduce everyone in a moment. Just a few technical details. As at every Visegrad Insight Breakfast, this session is on the record in the first part. It's off the record in the second part when we begin Q&A, commentaries, and the discussion between us. This session overall is bringing together diplomats, experts, journalists also from Central Europe and those interested on Central Europe, following our slogan, on Central Europe, from Central Europe. It's one of a series that you can find later on online, some of the recordings from previous sessions, and that we started early on back over, now it will be almost 2 years ago. And I'm here in the office, Respublika Foundation, where we had the initial morning coffee and croissant type of discussions. But COVID pushed us online, and now we're continuing in this here. So again, happy to see everybody with mics off. And today, the session, just before perhaps many of you go on holidays, a hot topic, however, not so much holiday topic. Very present and pressing and worrying topic on the China influence on the EU and the resilience of the EU against the foreign authoritarian influence in the bloc and overall on the continent. The developments of the last weeks and days even bring us worrisome news about Hong Kong. We see responses from many countries. We've seen responses for a long time from the US government and US Congress and Senate on China. We have seen also recently UK hardening the tone and definitely moving on China with serious diplomatic munition because of the breach that the UK portrays the current state of affairs as a breach on the deal to pass on Hong Kong from the British sovereignty to Chinese. Now we see the recent developments are hardening the position of the UK. There are, however, things to be looked at and monitored when it comes to EU, and there are some calls to action. So we couldn't have imagined a better group of speakers today who are practitioners, who are at the core of the effort to bring democratic resilience to Europe against authoritarian influence. Miriam Lexmann is with us, a Slovak member of European Parliament from the EPP group, previously one of the directors of the International Republican Institute and heading the Beacon project, securing Central European media space against the foreign authoritarian influence, especially Russian one. But now spearheading an effort for the EU to have a position on China, especially Hong Kong, and I'm sure she'll tell us more about that. Monika Richter, who was recently leaving the European Action External Service, having devoted a number of years in time and really through dedicated service to reinforcing information sphere from the fake news, from the disinformation spread from abroad on the EU, and she has deep insights into the Chinese affairs in the EU, especially when it comes to pressing on diplomatic level on the EU. And Peter Kreko, director of the Political Capital, professor of political psychology, and specializing also on the Russian influence, on the conspiracy theories the narratives that capture democratic mindset in the West, monitoring also activities of MEPs in a project that's we're also happily contribute to, finding out what are the authoritarian influence, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it. I ask all of you to give some short introductory statements, after which we'll continue with a fireside chat, and exactly at in 20 minutes we'll be turning off the recording to continue with Q&A. At any moment in time, please feel free to, and that's a comment to everyone, feel free to ask or comment in the chat box before even we open a live Q&A. Miriam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Wojciech. Thank you to Visegrad Insight to organize this very timely discussion. I would be very brief and maybe kind of bring an introduction. How did it happen that we appear in this challenge today? When we started, or I would say like when I started to work in the field of democracy support about 10, 15 years ago, I must admit that I kind of, as a person coming from an ex-communist country, I kind of did not understand where we are heading, that we are opening up our markets and trade and business with regimes like Russia and like China. And I, being a young person then, among experts and international big heads of strategic thinker who thought like, that economic interaction, as it was helping the new member states after we won over the communism, and this is very important, to integrate these countries into the rest of Europe and lately join the European Union. There was a plan that this kind of interaction can help to change Russia or later on China. Obviously, I think soon enough, we realized that this doesn't work. The Russian regime was stronger and stronger. Now we see that the human rights situation in China is becoming worse and worse rather than the opposite way. But we were unable to reverse the course because obviously of economic dependency from these powers and other powers as well. When we started to work on foreign influence, mainly Russian, but also we kept an eye on China about 6 years ago, when the whole discussion about disinformation, the influence of elections, or influence also of the population by direct influencing through media. I remember many discussions where I was trying to bring China on board, because saying that we see that there is a danger coming from China. Obviously, the main danger was mainly coming from Russia, or groups which were related somehow to Russia. But there was an obvious danger from China. And I remember numerous discussions where people were saying, yes, but there is a big difference between China and Russia. That Russia is ideological and is clearly standing against our free and democratic societies, rather than China wants only business, and they would never, they don't have a need to interact in terms of trying to change the population's opinion or trying to change the democratic decision making. And I remember then saying like, yes, but if there is a situation, geopolitical situation, that they would need to do that, they have all means to do it, and they probably will be, unfortunately, even better and more efficient in it than the Russians. Now the corona crisis has brought this kind of event, when China obviously started to realize that they need to influence the public opinion in the Western countries, because the blame was put, because of the COVID, was put on China. And we could see how prepared they actually were, that they could directly influence the decision-making of our populations or their opinions, because we saw that the opinions at the very beginning of the COVID was shifting towards China and towards Russia, that they are the only two countries who are really helping the population and fight the COVID, but also that they could influence the decision-making of the policymakers or the administration. I mean, we have a series of 3 huge events which showed how weak we are vis-a-vis this challenge of China, when we had China influencing EU report, this EU versus Disinfo report, when the EU was trying to summarize the influence of China on the decision making and on our population. We had the event when practically the letter of EU ambassadors to which was published in Chinese media were self-censored by the EU High Representative, or sorry, by the EU ambassador to China. And we also had numerous of articles when experts were saying that now, I mean, during the preparation of the trade deals with China, that human rights practically are outside of these debates, that they're not in the notes of the diplomats who are in charge of discussing the conditions of the trade deal or investment deal of China. These are absolutely serious allegations, especially the latter one is a direct breach of the EU treaties, because Article 21 in the treaties clearly said that EU foreign policy has to be based on the same values which brought together EU member states. So practically this means that we have, in order to keep the relationship with China working as it was, and then practically profiting from the economic part of the relationship, we were slowly giving up upon our own values. And I will just conclude here that I think that the situation will not change, and we will be not secure unless we realize that our values are not our weakness in foreign affairs, but our values are our strength. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Indeed, Miriam, I think exactly that summarizes, that's the last sentence summarizes the challenge we're facing. And we'll come back to you in a moment. Now, I wanted to ask Monika Richter to give us a bit of a insight from her perspective. Well, exactly as you were implicated in the affair on the report on China, to tell us from this perspective, perhaps using the very example, on how well equipped the EU is to be today to resist and to not to be under the Chinese influence, as Miriam is worrying it could happen.
Yes, well, thank you so much for having me here. I'm delighted now that I'm no longer an employee of the EEAS that I can speak on the record about this incident. So I'm sure that many of you have followed, or at least been aware of the media coverage of this particular incident. The Stratcom division at the European External Action Service, of which East Stratcom and EU versus Disinfo is one component, prepared this series of reports on foreign disinformation around COVID-19. The first one was published in mid-March, and then there were actually 3 more, and it was the third report that came under pressure from the Chinese. And the reason for that was that the internal version of the report had been covered in Politico. That internal version was shared with member states and within the EU institutions. And the Chinese became aware of the fact that there was this plan to publish the public version of the report, which called out China's global disinformation campaign around COVID to deflect responsibility for the spread of the virus, and also to mock the EU for its weak response, in which there was a grain of truth. And so the Chinese basically contacted our delegation, the EU delegation in Beijing, and implied that there would be very negative consequences for cooperation if this report was in fact published. That created a knee-jerk reaction within the EEAS that going up to the highest political levels of the cabinet to basically rethink what we were saying in this report. And so the public version, which had already been ready for publication, was stalled. And then we were instructed to edit it, basically not focusing on the two primary threat actors, Russia and China, for fear of appearing biased. So, I mean, it was basically a case of, political filtering and indeed self-censorship. Now, the final public report that was in fact put on the EU versus Disinfo website later that week did make references to China's disinformation efforts around COVID, but there were changes made. The references to a global disinformation campaign were omitted. There had previously been a section specifically devoted to China that was removed. China was grouped in, under other actors. Russia was really the only one that had its own section. Then, a couple of examples that the Chinese specifically had complained about, for example, this incident which the Chinese claimed, had been a bilateral dispute between China and France, where the CCP basically, wrote these op-eds in France saying that, the French were allowing their old people to die without care of COVID. Those examples got removed as well, and that was something specific that the Chinese had complained about to us. So the issue is not necessarily the final form of the report, which was actually, I would say, relatively okay. It was the fact that the self-censorship instinct was there. And to me, what that reveals is a fundamental lack of understanding within the EEAS and the EU institutions in general about how disinformation and malign influence operations actually work in order to make us second guess ourselves, second guess our conclusions, and to make us doubt ourselves and fail then to act in our own self-interest and defend our values. In the face of such crude intimidation tactics by an authoritarian regime, there is only one correct response, and that response, is basically to say, excuse me for putting it rudely, screw you. We are not going to accede to such demands. On the contrary, we are going to double down on our position because we know that it is correct, and here's the evidence. That report, by the way, was based exclusively on open source material because we are a Stratcom unit, because we do public communication. Everything that we produce has to be publicly verifiable. That's essential to our credibility and transparency. So, there was nothing, in this report that was sensitive or classified. All of it, even the internal version, was public information. So there was absolutely no good reason to censor this, to even pass it through this political filtering. And so, in the end, I guess we can look at the situation in two ways. On the one hand, yes, it looked very bad for the EEAS. On the other hand, because of the coverage that ensued, it also ended up being pretty bad for China, because it really, it was yet another example of, how intensively the Chinese are trying to manage the conversation about this. So, broadly, and then the other good thing, excuse me, I forgot that, was that, then after this incident, there was the EU-China summit. And there was a watershed moment there when von der Leyen, openly said to the face of the Chinese in an unprecedented way, the disinformation campaign around COVID and the cyber attacks on European hospitals are unacceptable. This kind of call out is something that, the EU has not done before vis-a-vis China. in the, or on the topic of influence. So I mean, that was a watershed moment. Now, whether it translates to practical changes in terms of how the EU or the EEAS approaches the question of Chinese subversive influence in the information space, let's say, I mean, that remains to be seen. So far, the EEAS Stratcom unit has only one analyst on China. He is a new hire. He does great work, but I mean, we are very far from having, a unit, focused specifically on China, the way that, for example, we have eStratcom, which focuses on Russia. In order to move in that direction, what we would really need is basically something like a mandate from EU member states to create such a task force, similarly to the way that, in fact, eStratcom was created in 2015 in the European Council conclusions. So, I mean, I'm definitely not wholly pessimistic about the EU's approach, because I do think that the COVID pandemic was a wake-up moment. But at the same time, the EU and the EEAS specifically, I mean, because it's a diplomatic institution, has a very difficult time putting itself in a strong posture vis-a-vis authoritarian regimes in general. That includes both Russia and China. There is this persistent sense that we have to talk things through. When in fact, if there are adversaries who are not playing by our rules, talking things through is impossible, and in fact is counterproductive and only compromises us. So again, I don't have a black and white view on the matter. I can go into some more details about this and the EU's broader kind of policy shift on China in the Q&A if there are interested questions, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. Yes, exactly. We will definitely come back to that and have questions and comments for sure. But before that, and thanks, Monika, for your input. Peter, I wanted to ask you to share some of the insights of the monitoring that is ongoing monitoring. It's not concluded yet. On how does that translate into concrete actions like voting patterns or communication patterns when it comes to members of the European Parliament, as a sample of how much influence there is actually on the political institutions and Parliament becoming stronger and more important, but also more exposed and perhaps vulnerable to foreign influence. So please, your take on it. And meanwhile, please, everyone, be prepared to start Q&A sessions in about 5-6 minutes, and you can use the chats function for that.
Yes, so thank you, Wojciech, for having me in this panel, and really happy to be in the same panel with fighters against malign influence who are fighting the good fight, both Miriam and Monika. I would add an analytic angle to the discussion, responding to a sub-question of the broader question that was raised in the title of the panel: how much the EU does against Chinese influence? And I would respond on the part of the European Parliament. And the good news, and it's because of the works of Miriam and many others, is that the European Parliament is the less problematic institution within the institutional framework of the European Union, and the institution that does, I think, the more to condemn and step up against malign forms of influence, including from China. How do MEPs vote in China-related resolutions? And I would come up with a few findings from a research project that we do in cooperation with the National Endowment for Democracy and in cooperation with partners from Central Eastern Europe, including Visegrad Insight. We will cover the whole in this project, we cover Russia-related, China-related votes in the European Parliament, and we'll also do for MEPs of 7 countries individual, let's say, track list on their votes in these issues. And what we found in a nutshell so far is that, first of all, there is an important shift in the European Parliament. So China appears much more in resolutions and decisions and discussions in the European Parliament than, let's say, 3-4 years before, or in the previous term. And this is already a very important shift. Second point, that most of the resolutions and statements are also, but I think it adds to the general, character of the European Parliament, are about human rights issues. So it's not that much about the money, it's about the values. Of course, it's an important topic. We found 2 resolutions where we had the so-called roll call votes, so where we can track individually how do MEPs voted. And Miriam, correct me if I missed something. One decision was about the state of human rights of the Uyghur minority in December 2019, where 94% of the members of the European Parliament voted in favor of a highly critical resolution. Another one was passed in June this year about Hong Kong, and it's a strong statement about the independence of the Hong Kong. And in this case, it was 85% of the MEPs that voted in favor of this resolution. Who did not support it, of course, fringes on the radical left, GUE, NGL, and on the radical right, mainly from the ID group and from the independents. So there were some countries, for example, in Greece and Cyprus, where the no votes were more than in other countries, but of course it was not a game changer. So it looks like to be a good news. What is the bad news? Is that even political forces that in their respective countries on government are doing quite a lot to open the door wide to malign foreign influence, either economically, either information-wise, or were also voted in favor of China critical statements, such as Fidesz from Hungary. So it doesn't mean that much. The problem is that the reason why many MEPs dare to support such critical resolutions is that unfortunately everyone knows that it won't really change the economic influence that China has in the European Union. And I think if we take a look at the heart of the problem, of course, information influence and information sovereignty is important, but the problem is that in the European Council and the European Commission, the very strong economic interests that are perceived by decision makers are going in the direction of diluting conflict with China and to open into this more pragmatic approach that Miriam and Monika already described. And I think that when it comes to the European Commission, of course, the European Commission was never the most hawkish institution of the European Union, to put it softly. And when it comes to the European Council, there are countries such as Greece and Hungary, for example, that did quite a lot to voter up resolutions and decisions on China-related issues, South China Sea conflict, 16+1 initiative, or Hong Kong issue, and there are also countries that just doesn't want to blow it too big, and I think two principles that we can see in most of the EU-related decisions, and especially in the European Council and the European Commission. First is that money talks, and until the general perception is that more business with China can be a savior of economic of the economy of the European Union, especially in troubled times such as we have after COVID, it will be always more important, unfortunately, than the values. And the second thing is that there are much more talk than action. So I highly welcome, for example, when in the European Commission's strategic outlook, we can read that China has become a systemic rival, or when as it was mentioned by Monika, Ursula von der Leyen raises critical remarks on China, or when COVID-19 a paper of the European Commission on the COVID-19 disinformation openly mentions China as a source of disinformation. These are all very important first steps, but it should be followed up by more substantial steps. And the willingness for that, I think, is still rather lacking from the most influential, most dominant players from the European Union.
Thank you, Peter. And we're now starting Q&A session, so that means